Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to all our listeners, our devoted listeners.
I have many millions of devoted listeners. And on the 2nd of January, to bring in the new year, we've been to see Nosferatu.
Yes.
A remake, a reimagining by writer-director Robert Eggers, who's The Lighthouse we've seen, The Northman we've seen, The Witch came out before we were doing the podcast. I haven't seen it. I know you have.
I have seen it, yeah.
And, you know, we like his films.
I do.
He has an incredibly strong, I think, sort of aesthetic sensibility. He takes his historical research extremely seriously, and his the occult bases upon which his films sometimes rely or partially rely, takes that incredibly seriously too. And you can feel it in the sincerity of the kind of production of his films, I think. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think he got his start as a stage designer, yeah? And design is a very powerful element in his films. This one, I think, looks amazing. It looks terrific. And all of his films have, I suppose, you know, they deal with the supernatural or the historic or folk history, they bring in all of those elements. And I think this one does as well, really. Yeah, so...
Yeah, despite the fact that Nosferatu, as a story originally, is kind of very well known for being this takeoff of Dracula that was made in 1922, and it was made without, you know, crediting or calling itself Dracula, so that it could avoid paying anything to Bram Stoker's estate. And of course, it didn't get away with it, and they were ordered to destroy the film. And the reason that we still have that original film today is because someone went, well, I'm not going to destroy my copy, you know, and so it was preserved. Both the original Nosferatu and Bram Stoker's Dracula novel are credited at the end here as inspirations for this new film. But it is interesting, like there are kind of folk and occult kind of demons and myths and things like that go back a very long time, and have bases in reality. You know, these are not reality as in they actually exist, but these are myths that really exist, right? People actually tell these stories. Nosferatu is not one of them. It was invented to be a film.
Yeah, but, you know, I went to Count Dracula's castle. I think I brought you a cup, in fact. Yes.
Yeah, oh yeah, I remember that, yeah. And Dracula as a character, as the Bram Stoker character, was inspired by... Oh, I can't remember the real person it was based on, but there was a figure that was this supposed Dracula figure, or the inspiration. So it's not to say there is no such real life basis, but this is much more drawn from just the world of imagination.
Yeah, though I was curious as to why Eggers credited the screenplay of Nosferatu, where he so clearly is indebted to the film as well. Like, so much of the imagery comes from the film.
Particularly those shots of Count Orlok's strangely long fingers in shadow going upstairs across the city. I think that might be a shot that's directly cribbed. I can't quite remember, but there are. That's an image that's not only kind of derives from the original Nosferatu and is quoted here, but it's just been quoted in cinema for 100 years. You know, yeah.
Anyway, I liked it very much, and I'm curious because I have some friends who just hated it, and I don't know if it's just because they are silent film purists who can't bear to see, any other kind of versions, really. But I really liked the film very, very much more than I expected to, actually. I thought it was, visually stunning, and I think it has depth, right? I think, we were talking to your brother earlier, and...
He just saw it yesterday.
And he just saw it yesterday, and he was giving me the impression, anyway, that he really liked the film in many ways, but that it's, to him, it felt lacking in relation to The Lighthouse, and I think, because The Lighthouse is kind of more visually out there and, ostensibly more conceptually out there. But actually, I think this film, has themes that are kind of interestingly brought out, right? And, kind of, I'm not sure how to read or extract all of it. But it seems to me, for example, one of the things that I find very interesting is that Nick Holt's character, who I think he's great at playing, right? And, my admiration for him after seeing The Juror and this,
Juror number two,
so close together, just has risen enormously. He in the film is like the damsel in distress, right? Yeah, and in fact, kind of a lot of the things that people have written about Nosferatu, right? About, Nosferatu is always interesting to gay audiences because, of course, kind of Nosferatu is omnisexual, right? And, the thinking of the teeth and the blood is like a penetration. And, it bypasses gender. Yeah, he does it to anyone. But nonetheless, it's not just a violence. It's like a kind of a sexual violence and a penetration, and more than that, in the sense that it could also be reproduction. Yeah, and it could also be a linking of minds and souls, right? Like, so kind of all of these ideas of, sex and romance and so on are kind of allegorized through that bite. Yeah. And the film makes it explicit. Yeah, there's a scene where the wife says, "Oh, he took you like a lily." I forget what the language that she used, right? So I love how the film renders that explicitly. It also has these themes about gender throughout, right? Like kind of with the juxtaposition of the Aaron Taylor Johnson character and what he represents, which is empiricism, reason, but, kind of also patriarchal might and, the injustice of that, right? So she berates him for tying her up and all of that stuff.
Yeah. So, despite the fact he was saying, "I've been nothing but kind to you, I've been as kind as I possibly could," and that's her response. You tied me up.
I know. But you could understand it from his point of view as well, right? Like,
well, yeah, to keep it, because she was somnambulatory, she was walking around in her sleep, and they didn't know what was going on. So it's how do we keep her safe? But there's also that feeling. It reminded me rather of Hexen, the documentary that we saw, which was all about kind of the history of witches and witchery, and then it culminates in this chapter, which essentially says this is all just like writing off women's problems. Quote unquote. Like the idea of witches is essentially saying we don't even wish to try to understand women. We see them as something else ununderstandable. We just put them away in our insane asylums, whatever. It kind of reminded me of that, like the writing off of a woman's sort of problem.
I think the film is complicated on that, really, because, so on the one hand, what drives the Lily
Rose Depp.
Yeah, what's the character's name?
Eleanor.
What drives Eleanor mad is sexualized. Yeah, it's like.
Oh, sorry, Ellen.
Yeah, it's her sexual voraciousness. Yeah, it's like basically, it's her sexuality that gets her into trouble, right? That's what kind of brings Orlok in, and simultaneously, that's what also kills him. But it's at the price of her death. So you could argue that a reading of the film is that women wanting sex results in death. Yeah. So, but I think kind of, the film has kind of really interesting juxtaposition between, women's sexuality kind of versus kind of patriarchal order. She, in fact, is what saves the world, right? So it kills her, but it saves the world. So it's a sacrificial thing. I mean, it's unusual and interesting. Yeah, and those ideas are there. There's also kind of the idea of, what can be known empirically and what is outside kind of the realm of, empirical knowledge, which is kind of nonetheless a knowledge, which the film valorizes. So I liked all of that.
I want to talk about its use of colour in that respect.
I love that.
I found this really fascinating, especially early on, especially kind of around the time that from the start, when we're in that first kind of dream/memory sequence, up until Thomas, the Nicholas Hoult character, encounters Count Orlok and is trapped by him and so on. The long kind of scene of just sort of a growing madness. The thing about colour is the film absolutely has a debt in its colour design to the way that films were coloured in the silent era. And
I thought exactly the same thing.
Including Nosferatu, right? So colour processes essentially didn't become like really fully developed and industrialised until the 1930s. But there was colour in film before then. It would be kind of hand painted.
Yeah, there was tinting and toning and filters.
It would be tinted and it would be dyed in post processing. And very often you could literally like paint. Like there are film strips you can see from like the 1910s of someone dancing and their dress is goes from red to green to blue because it's been hand done in interesting ways. But more generally, and certainly for kind of more mass production, it would be done with just tinting of the whole frame. So at night it will be tinted blue, and in the day it will be tinted red or orange. And it was kind of a very generalised sort of tonal setting that would give it. This film does that, right? But it doesn't just do it straight up. It has an interesting aesthetic kind of schema to it, which I was thinking my way through, because it's to do with liminality and expressing liminality, I think, between kind of reality or the kind of empirical reality you talk about Aaron Taylor Johnson's character in particular being associated with, and not exactly another world or another reality, but the supernatural, the dark. It's a very general kind of, I think of it quite loosely. I thought of it quite loosely when I was watching it. As you become kind of slightly untethered from reality, or other worldly influences begin to play more strongly, just in the tone, you find that colour is reduced, right? And when I say reduced, what I mean is you'll end up with monochrome sometimes.
It feels like a black and white film for large chunks of it.
Yeah, and I was thinking, I don't think it's quite black and white. I think there's a tinge of blue in that, but it is, it's monochrome, right? And it's definitely sort of evoking a black and white feeling to a degree. But it's not quite as simple as that, right? It's not quite as simple as when you're in a dream or some degree of unreality, there's just no colour. It's that the balance of colour will shift. So when you're in a kind of uncontroversial reality, like for instance when Ellen is with the family she's staying with and they're by the sort of riverbank, right? It's quite conspicuous, even though it's not very colourful. Like it's not bold.
Yeah, it's grey in fact, but
it's always
colour.
It's quite faint, but the river is blue, the grass is green, what she's wearing is kind of red and green, and you see all these different colours. And what happens is, as the film gets into more, as I say, sort of supernatural areas, the range of colour will be reduced, up until the point where sometimes it's completely monochrome. And that's kind of at the most extreme kind of edges of reality. That's where you are then. But it'll be things like, I'm thinking of when Thomas is kind of being first sort of attacked by Count Orlok. And actually, as a side note, there is this thing about how Nosferatu is like not the guy's name. It's the Nosferatu word for a vampire. But here, the film seems reasonably open about just calling him Nosferatu. The Willem Dafoe character does that. So as he's being kind of attacked at first and entrapped by Nosferatu, and he goes to kill him in his coffin. We find him in his coffin. He tries to kill him. The film is completely monochrome then. And then as he kind of escapes and he goes out into the snow outside, it's mostly monochrome, but you see there's a hint of flesh tone in his skin. You feel it a little bit. And then as he goes back inside, he opens that kind of cellar door. The film has a very natural way of finding ways to reduce the colour. Like all of a sudden, we've got one source of light. And so if there's only one source of light, then that means there's only one colour to reflect things, which gives you a natural way of reducing the range of colours you'll be showing. It can work that way. The film, I think, makes it work that way. It's just, I found it so interesting that instead of, there is a feeling, I think, right from the opening titles, the movie logos, right, which are they are like 100-year-old
Germanic Gothic.
Yeah, and they're meant to look like they're meant to evoke old titles, or maybe some of them even are old sort of film logos, it reminds me of Tarantino immediately, because that's the sort of thing he does. He'll use like an old Universal logo or whatever it is, right, to start his film off. But there's always a feeling with Tarantino that there's so much irony built into that.
Nothing in this film reminds me of Tarantino.
But you see what I mean, right? The kind of in that evocation of a bygone era's aesthetic, right? There is a similarity, but Tarantino always feels ironic. It always feels put on, and maybe it's just a prejudice that I don't feel that here. And I'm thinking about that in the same way with the way in which monochrome imagery is used. I don't know. It just feels it feels, and I don't think it's necessarily as strict as I'm implying. You know, I'm sort of saying that as you get closer to the spirit realm, let's say, you know, colour is reduced. And I think it's quite a general thing. It's not always the case, but it's a general aesthetic. And I'm not sure that if you went through it frame by frame, you go, actually, this is like coded like this. It's a tonal, general feeling thing. And it just feels very authentically kind of expressed or expressive in the film. I love the look of it.
Where I noticed it the most is the scene where the wife goes downstairs. Yeah, Aaron Taylor-Johnson's wife goes downstairs looking to see what the noise is. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden she looks like a Rubens painting. Yeah, her flesh becomes white, and her hair becomes really reddish blonde and, yeah, kind of glowing. And, you know, you have this image of, I don't know, something human before you meet the darkness. Right? Yeah, and I thought that was very beautiful, really. And the film is full of touches like that. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is the kind of the element of creativity to it that I especially like is that the film doesn't restrict itself to treating it like an equation. Like, as we get closer to spirits, the colour goes down. It will make decisions based on what feels right for the colour to look like. And if there is a reason for everything to look completely blue, apart from the flaming torch someone's holding, then the torch will happily look orange and red and yellow. You know, like it's happy to select where it's limiting its color palettes, depending on, just as I say, what's the feeling that it's trying to generate.
One of the things that interested me was kind of your brother saying that he's beginning to think that Eggers isn't a great director. Yeah, even though he's made all these very interesting films. I mean, all of them are at least interesting. Yeah?
Sure. Yeah.
However, you can argue they're more or less successfully kind of realized. And, you know, I think at least for now, right, because one of the things that struck me is how young this guy is, right? Like, you know, he's been making films for 10 years and he's 41, right? So, you know, kind of, he's a young, well, to my mind at least, he's still a very young director. Right?
Yeah.
So, you know, you give them slack in the sense that, you know, there's room for them to learn and grow and, you know, do incredible things. And I think The Lighthouse for me was a great film. But I think he's got something there, because I thought some of the actors were very poorly directed. Some of the scenes, to me, like, you know, I thought Aaron Taylor-Johnson was awful. Yeah, kind of, you know, he's meant to play a role that, what's the guy who's Superman and The Witcher?
Oh, Henry Cavill.
Henry Cavill. He's meant to play a role that Henry Cavill would do in his sleep. Yeah, you know, that kind of addy, slightly bluffy, middle upper class Englishman, right?
Somewhat
like,
pompous,
somewhat
dismissive.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, you know, he'd do it in his sleep. And I thought Taylor-Johnson wasn't believable, really. It felt like almost, you know, he couldn't even speak the dialogue properly. He couldn't do the accent. I mean, he's an Englishman who can't do posh middle class, right? Like, it's bizarre. I don't think I've ever encountered it, really. He still sounds like East End somehow, right? So, and he didn't look quite right, although that was more the filming. I thought the little girls were obnoxious, right? So what I think what I'm trying to say is that there's this thing about the direction of actors, right? That's still problematic. So, you know, obviously there are some great performances in the film, but you think that really has to do more with what the actors give him than what he could get from the actors, right? So that's one element. The other element is that, and this is just a kind of intuition, that I felt, even though the look is spectacular, right, as soon as the camera gets in motion, you think he could be doing more. Yeah, like kind of all of the street scenes in The Plague, yeah, of the town. You think in the hands of another director there would be like sweep or, you know, sadness, or you'd get a sense of the destruction of it and so on. And actually, you know, it felt kind of amateurish, really, for me.
I have a sense
things.
of what you mean about kind of larger scale things. I must say, I did notice the way he was moving the camera within scenes of dialogue there between two or three characters, and I thought I really enjoyed that. Actually, he was doing things that, if you were lazier, you would just cut from one to, you know, back and forth and shot reverse shot and things. But he's orchestrating characters in space and moving the camera to frame and reframe and doing things in a long take where a lot of short ones someone else would do, which I really enjoyed.
I thought that was fine. But, you know, think of how other films, you know, not the least Murnau, like the sense of dread and fear that they evoke just through the image of the castle, right?
Yes.
You know, and it's just through the positioning of the camera, the creating a particular angle that exudes, you know.
I do know what you mean, and I think actually when it comes to the castle in particular that you mentioned, there is a sense in which I think the music is doing an awful lot of work of setting that tone of fear.
Exactly.
That the image is not quite satisfying.
I also think, you know, that there's more. So on the one hand, you know, I love the introduction of Nosferatu through the drapes, the transparent kind of drapes. Yeah. You know, I thought that was like a beautiful beginning. So on the other hand, I also thought more could have been made of the figure of Nosferatu.
The physical figure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, so you have this actor who's extremely tall. Yeah, there's this extraordinary makeup job.
Bill Skarsgård plays Nosferatu.
But actually, there's something about the way that he's visualizing the rest of the film that actually kind of somehow lacks potency and threat, you know.
I also know what you mean, and I would also again say this really occurred to me as something that the sound design was doing, which I think it was fun for me to think about this because obviously the film upon which it's based is silent, and the depth and sort of design, because it's, you know, had that kind of effects applied, of Count Orlok's voice is so important to the creation of his character and the creation of the threat that he imposes, because it's definitely a very conspicuous decision to show you very little of him or show him in ways that are segmented. So, you know, you'll see the back of their head or a lot of focus on his hands and nails, or ways that are, you know, obscure. So particularly thinking about when Thomas first meets him, a lot of out of focus. And you're kind of thinking, when will we get to see this guy? And you're not really going to for a very long time. He's going to be silhouetted or out of focus or in shadow, that kind of thing. And I think part of that is, I wonder whether, like in general, with a kind of movie monster, you think the moment that the audience gets to see him is like the moment of truth. Like, is this monster scary or not? Like, you know, because you in fact, in the last podcast we did on Nosferatu 1922, you talked about seeing the Herzog one and how a woman in the audience, you remember this, right?
Yes, kept laughing
whenever Nosferatu showed up, and it's like ruined the experience, right? Yes. Because like all of a sudden you've just got this woman who thinks this looks silly, and you do wonder whether like there's a fear of that, so you restrict how he looks, but you can imply all this threat with sound, which I think the film does extremely effectively. I love the sound of his voice and the way he speaks, the accent that he has, and the slowness.
Yes, I'm not sure I do. It felt really rote.
I also think that there is, and this is one of the things that you're saying this, it also feels not just rote, but a trope.
Yeah.
And I think actually there's a surprising amount in this film which I find tropey. And one of the things my brother was just saying to us in the car was, after the film stops kind of introducing threat and spending time in a kind of dreamy spirit realm, it becomes like quite a lot of business, because it starts to become about, you know, explaining or understanding the threat of Nosferatu and what he's going to bring, and there's business about tracking him down and working him out and that kind of thing. And I agree with him on this, that it does kind of slow the film down in some ways, and it's a little bit of a turn off. And part of it is that this is a trope which I don't remember to what extent this element of the story is true of the original film. but it is certainly a trope generally in supernatural horror films, where you have the thing of the expert who was decried because he believed in something and everyone's laughed at him, and now we need him, which is the Willem Dafoe character in this, and so he comes in with his knowledge and expertise, and he understands the occult, and he understands this demon, and we have the kind of group of characters who are trying to get ahead of it, track it down, and that is. Even if that's true of the original film, and it's there to some extent, I don't remember, it has certainly become a trope over time. And now it feels quite disappointing to feel that represented here in something which I was hoping would feel much more, despite being a remake, much more original than that.
Well, I minded that less than the giving of the deadline. So, yeah, we now have 3 days, and one person will die each day. I mean, I don't per se mind that there's a deadline, but surely the reason for the deadline is to create tension and suspense. Will they make it, right? And this had none of the tension or the suspense, that you expect of that kind of deadline. You're racing against time, right? Like, yeah. So I thought that was a problem as well, though maybe for different reasons. And one of the things that I thought was a major problem was the whole with Aaron Taylor Johnson. And again, so this is now, I'm not criticizing him now, though I think his performance isn't very good, but I'm criticizing what the director does with that, because surely the reason for having that whole subplot is also you want to get a sense of loss. I mean, here's, a man who you think has tried to be good, but is kind of, burdened by old-fashioned patriarchal ideas, but who's a loving father, he's a loving husband, he loses everything, and yet you feel very little at his loss, even though his wife is pregnant with a child, right? Like, I think that moment really should have been made more emotionally significant than the film does.
I think that generally I have limited feeling for the characters. I think that may be related to what you're talking about, the lack of tension in that 3-day deadline, because I don't really care if any of them dies. It's also that I do remember from the original film he is going to get defeated. Of course, the question is exactly how they'll do it in this film, but I remember, I didn't suspect they were going to change that element of it. So that may be part of it, because I know what happens. But there is a feeling of like, so the Thomas character is threatened that he will die on the 3rd day. I don't really care if he does or not. Like, that's the kind of end, that's the deadline. But I don't know. Doesn't bother me.
Well,
and that's, despite I like the actor, I like the character. I think that's all very good, and I agree with what you say about Nicholas Hoult. As I said in the Juror Number 2 podcast, the guy's just completely turned me around recently on him. Like, I love him. I think he's wonderful. He's wonderful in this. But I didn't care whether he lived or died.
I think the reason for it is because the film doesn't allow itself to go with some of the themes that it set up. Because another of those kind of structural oppositions that the film sets up is this thing about, like, sex versus love, right? Yeah, and sex with love, right? So, kind of Nosferatu is like pure sex, yeah, that kind of turns dark and violent, and that initially starts off with pleasure, and but kind of rapacious, and she kind of loves that. And Jonathan, is it Jonathan, the husband? Thomas represents kind of love, really, and so kind of the way of working that towards the ending is, she dies, so the sex culminates in a kind of death, and he ends up loveless. So, kind of, the film doesn't give you an emotional kind of out on any of it, really. I mean, had she survived, it might have been different.
I also think there's the thing that you mentioned about saving the world, which they do talk about, but it's slightly ill-defined. They say everyone will die, but what exactly Orlok wants, if he wants, more deaths than just the people we're seeing, because obviously he's like primarily motivated by the Ellen character,
Yes.
if he wants the deaths of everyone else, and we do see that shot of the hand reaching over the town, like the town will be mine sort of thing, we don't really get that. And I listened back to that podcast we did, as I said, on the first one, and one of the things that I mentioned was in the boat ride over to the town, because he comes from Transylvania to the town in Germany. One thing that I mentioned was a feeling of impending pestilence. Like pestilence is coming, right? And I think the association with the Black Death seems to have been stronger in that film. At least we mentioned it.
So, yeah.
We mentioned it a little bit more in that podcast. And the film does mention the Black Death here, and there is a continued imagery of rats. And then, one of the things about that kind of tropey thing is we think it's a Black Death, and then no, we realise it's more than this.
The thing with the rats is also, I thought, a missed opportunity in the film. Because this idea, it could be so disgusting and dreadful, and so much more could have been made of that.
Well, that's kind of where I'm going. Like you were saying about the imagery of the kind of the general threat to the wider world that is being brought by Orlok and by the Black Death, could be much stronger here. And from what I remember, it seemed stronger in the original film, and I think that may also be because the kind of identification with or concentration on those specific characters and their relationships in the original film is less strong than it is here. It is absolutely about those characters, but here I think it's partially a consequence of the film being longer, the film being dialogue heavy, the film having generally films kind of building in more intricate plots these days. I think there is much more focus on the individual characters' relationship with this threat and with each other, and you get much less of a sense, if any, of there being a threat to the wider world here.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the film does say so, because obviously if they don't destroy Nosferatu, the town is destroyed, and then who knows beyond that.
But as I say, that's so ill-defined.
Yeah.
I don't feel it at all, really.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because, of course, all of these things rely on a sense of evil, of good and bad, of morality, of, kind of, a culture, a religious culture in a way, right? Like, the sense of an afterlife, of the devil, of, and you wonder how much weight those things have in a secular society. But the thing is that the film doesn't replace the rationale with anything else, right? So it's using these tropes of a religious culture in, a non-religious context. Or, I mean, obviously, I'm sure lots of parts of the US and the audience for this film might be religious. But it certainly kind of, relies on those things, I mean, the solution is prayer, that old woman says, you have to pray, kind of, well, what is the power of prayer if you don't believe in God, right? Like, what are you praying to?
Yeah, well, there is definitely a difference. I'm curious exactly what you're saying, because there's certainly a difference to be drawn between the secularism of the society that the film is going into, which is the Western world is kind of fairly heavily secular. I think we've talked about before, at least I've talked about horror films kind of being the only place where kind of religion is sort of taken seriously as something where that could be real, because they need you to believe in the demon, the evil, and so on and so forth. So there's a difference between that and the religiosity or secularism of the world in which the film is set. There's certainly a kind of Christian society in the film. We see crosses a few times. We hear the girls say, those little obnoxious girls. They say, "As I lay me down to sleep, pray God. I pray to God my soul to keep." Whatever. I'm not a Christian, but that thing. And in fact, when they said that, I was like, "Good fucking luck, girls." That means you're, And in fact, it was interesting. Not only was it good fucking luck, but it was the fact that there has been a second's focus on them saying this means I'm pretty sure they're going to die now. Like, the film is going to point out that was useless. And even though it's not heavily religious at all, but God is mentioned a couple of times, and Willem Dafoe talks about keep God in your heart when they're kind of planning how they're going to kill Orlok in that cab.
The
keep going
film,
with
is full of a god that no one believes in.
Like, yeah, it doesn't feel embodied at all. It doesn't feel like anyone really has anything to do with God, and that God could be on your side, that God could have an effect. It's just something that they say, and the film, whether it's a failing of the film that it doesn't make you believe that, or whether it's just something that they say.
It's a failure in the film, because another reference point, I don't know if you got it, but it's The Exorcist.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, when you watch The Exorcist, whether you're a believer or not, the film kind of, makes you believe that, like, its tensions are real, or they're real in that particular narrative, right? And you go with them, and kind of, if you're scared because of it, and kind of, you believe that there's a devil in that girl, right? I didn't in this at all.
No, maybe there is. It's funny. One of the things that we talked about when we talked about The Exorcist is that there is a trope of the possessed person, normally a girl, being tested. We go to the doctors, and when the doctors say we don't know, we can't figure this out, then the occult or religion
priest,
becomes a real possibility. But it's like you have to explain to the audience that this is beyond our understanding first.
Yeah.
This film doesn't quite do that. That you have the scientific character, or let's say scientific character, just the one who is most associated with dismissing these concerns. You have him, but there is no point at which we kind of go, like, we've tried this out and we know this isn't this, it has to be something else. It just kind of, it generally, the one character, the Ralph Ineson character, says, I know this guy, and he's the, kind of occult expert that everyone laughed at, and we should go visit him, we should start listening to him, and we just do start listening to him. There's no kind of, that specific trope of, we've tried this and proven it inadequate, now we must try something else, is not quite here. It's more just, I think there's something else going on, we'll listen to the guy.
We've been doing the same thing that your brother did, which is, we've been criticizing kind of so much about the film that we find unsatisfactory, and yet, my overall impression was that I really liked watching it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I can't emphasize that enough. And it's not just based on the one thing that I have, kind of outwardly praised, which is the look and sound design. But I think that is probably the thing I find strongest. But it is that, especially that entire opening section. And it's not just the opening, it's, the whole kind of first act and maybe more, where the film is not concerning itself with, what's going to happen next in the plot, what are the specific developments and blah, blah, blah. It's just leading you into this world that you're not quite going to understand, that there is threat that you don't understand, that the Thomas character is getting in over his head. It's also partly, and it is so much to do with that character, in fact, and not just, it's partially how it's written, it's partly how it's performed. It's to do with his innocence isn't quite the right words. His inability to refuse things. Like, I have to go here, this is my job, and even though things are kind of getting quite weird and quite threatening, I can't say no to anything. This count's got me in his house, and he's making me call him Lord, he's making me drink this thing, and if I say no, like, everything, maybe he's not thinking I could die here, but I'm being incredibly threatened, and he's unable to express anything, to stand up for himself. The one time he tries to, he says, like, I really must leave, I've got to go home. He's shut down. Even then, it's kind of surprising that he even has the balls to do that based on what we've seen of the character so far, kind of.
Yes, though, I mean, in a way that didn't bother me, because you think, well, it's the 19th century, and, there is that class system. Yeah,
no, it doesn't bother me. That's what I'm saying. I really like that. I like the way it sets up this. It's like that in a horror movie. You always have that thing, or very often have that thing of, like, the kids in the cabin and they're making stupid decisions. And you always go, if you only fucking wouldn't open that book of prayer and read from it, then none of this would have happened. You fucking idiots. That's not what's happening here, right? This isn't like, I'm not shouting at the screen going, no, don't do that, don't do that. Like, I get him. But it does have that thing of, like,
well,
the way he is making all this happen.
Well, no, because she made it happen before, since she was a young girl. So, I mean, I think what's interesting to me was that he's doing all of this for a future with Ellie, right? And then that's what the film denies you at the end.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So, and I think the Nicholas Hoult character is kind of a really, really interesting one that maybe deserves more thought, because he is filmed as an object of desire. Yeah, he looks really beautiful, and he exudes warmth and kindness, and he's really in love with her, and they obviously have a fantastic sex life. Kind of, you're told that because, their great sex life is what's preventing Count Orlok from getting into her mind, right? Yeah. So you have like this potential fusion of like great sex, kind of, swoony romanticism, and the film cheats you of that at the end.
I was going to say something else. I was going to add something. It's gone.
Okay. Well, I think that's all I want to say about the film, really. I think it looks terrific. It's got great imagery. I really enjoyed watching it. I think it's also, got some themes that it's embedded quite systematically and quite interestingly, that maybe deserve more unpacking than I'm able to provide at the moment, having seen it only once. I really loved watching it, but I think it's not a great film.
No, it's sort of not, but it's an extremely enveloping thing to see. We saw it at the IMAX Digital in Birmingham, which has a very nice big clear screen.
Yeah,
and we saw it with a reasonably full audience that mostly shut the fuck up throughout the film. Like, they were engaged.
Yeah,
it's I wish that it had been less accessible. We talked about this before with The Northman, I think, because The Northman had a budget of like $70 million, and it was there was a responsibility to attract an audience to that film in the way that there hadn't been for The Witch and for The Lighthouse, which had much lower budgets.
And let me tell you, The Northman, for me, is almost instantly forgotten.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't tell you a single image from that film, right? Whereas actually, I think there are many in this film that I will remember.
Yeah, so one of the criticisms that I think not only we made, I think was generally made of The Northman, was that because it had this budget, there was good reason to make it more accessible to a kind of mass appeal or a bigger audience. Because one of the things that we loved so much about The Lighthouse was it was just so kind of laser focused on being its own thing, and either you were on the train with it or you weren't, in a way. And Robert Eggers himself talked about that kind of that need to open up his films to make them more readable to a wider audience that isn't necessarily on that train. And as I recall, he kind of spoke about it in slightly positive terms, because one thing that he talked about, a lot of creative people talk about, is when a pressure is put on you by the powers that be, that can force you to do different things and think in a different way. And very often that's something that creative people find they end up getting something out of. They don't always love that, of course. But here you feel some of that need to be accessible still, particularly with all of that kind of second half stuff where the trope of chasing down the demon, working it out, comes into play. But that first half is just a kind of it's poetic and lyrical and sensual and weird, and takes you in all these different threatening directions. It's quite legible. It's got a plot and everything. It's not like Dali or something. But I wish the film had stayed there, basically stayed in that mode.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, because this is, to my mind, a relatively low budget for a film like this, right? It
50 million?
50 million. So when you compare it to something like, 350 million for the Avengers films, or, whatever a film, an A-budget film now is probably about 100 million.
Oh, yeah.
So this is kind of relatively low budget. It's got stars, not the biggest, but stars. And I think what they've done with it is kind of amazing. And of course, the Lighthouse, which had a budget of 11 million, so a fifth of this, surely gives more freedom. It was a much more experimental film in all kinds of ways. But that is its own genre of film, and I really appreciated what he did here, really.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's absolutely worth seeing.
And it's doing a lot more than this kind of mid-range American cinema normally does. I mean, this is a film that I think is full of ideas, even if at the moment they seem badly worked out to me, right? But I think there is a kind of an intent at kind of, expressing something serious, about things that are important, in a way that a lot of horror films do. But I think this is kind of more artful and more complex than, your run-of-the-mill film. And I think it also provides kind of gore, at least. I'm not sure about scares, but definitely kind of things you want to move your eyes away from.
It brings you a few jump scares, at kind of moments of high tension where like two characters having sex and then an image of someone else, Count Orlok or whatever, shows up, or Lily Rose Depp's face, but now it's covered in blood, whatever it was, and it will be accompanied by a loud musical thing. So that's obviously a very very common horror thing that is being employed here. So it has those moments, and there are things that will creep you and stuff. But yeah, it's more generally like, I sort of think with horror, speaking very generally, the kind of requirement that we feel for it to have scares is, it seems obvious that it should do that. It's horror, it's supposed to scare you, but whether it scares you or not, I often find is kind of immaterial, because unless it's obviously setting out to get those effects and not getting them, then it's just a bad film. But it's so often horror is just about the tone, the feeling, like the place we're trying to get you emotionally, the feeling that we're trying to generate. Scare isn't everything,
Well, it is, to me it is. Yeah. So, but I take your point that there are different kinds of scares. And there's the one that kind of make you scream in the cinema. But then, like, for example, the original Nosferatu film, I think it kind of gets in your bones, right? Like, so when you're watching it, you might not go, ah, right? But kind of, you then do end up thinking about, things that you have nightmares over.
You might do. But I think horror just feels more general than that. Like, you can get scary horror or just non-scary horror that's nonetheless still horror. It's in a horror milieu somehow. But and this, I kind of feel that's where this is. I really like that though. Because I think horror, the way I'm speaking about it, is something that gives, it's a genre and kind of a framework that I think gives filmmakers a space to be, to let their imaginations freer than they can in other genres.
I think that's true.
Which are required to be more by the numbers and less expressive.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's why so much of the best kind of social critique is kind of worked through in the horror genre in a way that other genres, you don't even see it there, So everything from like racism to class to kind of sex, gender, like kind of all, that's kind of what horror does, really. In a way that no other genre takes that kind of leap of imagination. Like, what was that film where you're allowed to kill one person a year, whoever you want, right? The Purge, I mean...
one day you can do what you want.
Yeah, I mean, kind of, there are fascinating ideas that are brought out in a film like that in a way that kind of is not quite permissible in other genres.
It's funny that you mentioned The Purge as an example of that, because I love The Purge, and we saw on the podcast the first Purge, the prequel one, which we really, really liked, and we found all this kind of interesting sort of expression of racism and racial dynamics in that film. But it's so funny that you mentioned The Purge as an example, because that is so seen as the worst example of this kind of thing. Like, people have this, it's like, oh yeah, one day you get to kill anyone you want, like, it's such a dumb idea, and that's how people just see that film.
Well, I can't vouch for the other ones, but I thought the first one was great. Then there was also one, I forget what it's called, about a woman who turns down a mortgage.
Drag Me to Hell.
Drag Me to Hell, exactly. Wonderful, right? And again, kind of reflecting those social anxieties that kind of people have about, kind of powerlessness and housing.
Well, that was in the middle of the financial crisis, exactly. 2009, so in the middle of, or just,
I thought it was great.
That actually just reminds me of the thing that I've forgotten earlier, which is not a huge point, but it occurs to me is one of the things that I liked about that section where Thomas is getting in over his head and not able to say no to things, whatever, is him signing the contract that he can't read.
Yeah.
So the contract is, I want to buy this house in your... Well, he's told the contract is going to be, I want to buy this house in your village.
But instead he's selling his wife.
But all of a sudden, he's presented with a contract that's in, an ancient script that he can't read. And it's not... the camera doesn't focus on that to go, oh, by the way, he can't read this. It's just if you look at the words, you go, oh wait, they're not words, right? And then or has a line where he says, "This is in the language of my old tongue," and all this. And he's just so terrified and imposed upon that he isn't able to say, I can't sign this, I can't read it. He's just, I'm here to sign this. And as you say, that contract is secretly this one that is, actually, I don't use the word contract, it's all covenant, antiquated sort of religious language. It's a covenant that binds his wife to him, which again has this patriarchal elements of, he owns his wife enough to give her away, right?
Because basically, he signs that covenant thinking of their future, which the signing destroys. And then she gives herself to him, saving the husband, knowing that she will be destroyed in that process, right? So I think it's an interesting thing, but I think it could have been worked out better and more emotionally resonant. I mean, the thing is, I loved watching all of it, but I wasn't moved by any of it.
What else goes along with the signing of the covenant in this film is what you do for money. Right, there is an enormous bonus in this for you. A box of gold will come to you if you sign this contract. He's promised by the Simon. Hold on, what's his name?
But I never get the sense that the Nicholas Hoult character is driven by money.
He's not driven by money, but he's attracted by money, and he needs money. They talk about, by doing this, I will secure my future with you.
With you, yeah. They want to set up a home and so on.
Yeah, so it ultimately comes down to his love.
Yeah, you don't get a sense that he's like the Michael Douglas character in Wall Street or anything, right?
Certainly not.
He's just someone who wants a job, actually, because the end result of this, is him getting a full-time job at this estate agency. It's not, that he's going to win the lottery or anything.
No, absolutely not. But nonetheless, there is a focus in all of that early on stuff on you'll be richly rewarded. Not only in terms of money that he's being offered, but also when he goes to they use the word gypsy, the kind of Romany sort of traveller sort of encampment and minor sort of village that he winds up in. We don't want you here, you're an outsider, go away, don't mention the name of Count Orlok, and then I'll pay you double to stay here. He gets to stay there.
That scene wasn't very well worked through either. Yeah, I would have liked more tension, more threat, more mysteriousness, moments of revelation of why they're behaving this way.
Yeah, I get that. But yeah, it just made me think it's the same thing that we learned from Shrek 4, is the evils of the contract. Which, by the way, I might watch that again tonight because I remember really enjoying Shrek 4. It's all about how there's loads of Shreks, and it's to do with because he signs a contract with Rumpelstiltskin, who is the contract figure from folklore. If you can guess my name, then you can keep your kid, but you can't guess my name and all that, and he signed the contract. And I'm sure he was the character in Shrek 4 who they signed a contract with, and then all of a sudden, if he can't fix the contract or whatever it was in 3 days, then he literally dies. Shrek will be erased, and we can't have that. No. Amazing film.
Anyway, let's wrap this up. So I enjoyed it very much, and I encourage everyone listening to see it, even with all the criticisms that we've made of it. It looks fantastic, and I enjoyed it very much.
Absolutely. It's in complete agreement. It's a marvellous place to spend your time. Go see it.
Thank you very much for listening. We are Eavesdropping at the Movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, and YouTube Music. On social media, we're on Facebook, Twitter @EavesdropMovies, Blue Sky, eavesdropping.bsky.social, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Simon McBurney, that's the fellow's name. I really like him. I like seeing a kind of somewhat venerable sort of English actor end up on his knees, naked, just like going, Count Orlok, I love you. That's an interesting little thing actually as well. Just a very minor thing is that he has this love for Count Orlok, and then like his kind of character arc with story winds up with that thing of accepting that Orlok doesn't love him back, sort of thing.
Yes.
This is kind of funny and weird. And
yes, I mean, I thought that also wasn't very well worked out, really.
no, but it was quite goofy and funny, and I like that sort of thing.